Stevens T. Mason came to us at a very young age in 1830. He was appointed as the Territorial Secretary at 19, which is a record probably that will never be broken. And another record that certainly will never be broken was in 1835 when at age 24 he was elected the first state's governor. And in time, the people of Michigan and the people of Detroit came to trust him as, even though a young person, a very skilled and dedicated leader. Well, Mason was regarded, first of all, as by the people in his own territory as a bit of an interloper, just coming in from Kentucky, when the logical thing for Jackson to do would have been to appoint a Michigan person, a Detroit politician, to the number 2 position in the territory. But because Mason had made such an impression on Jackson himself, they had met. And Jackson thought, this young man has a lot of confidence in himself and vision, so that I'll appoint him. The strip of land that was disputed between Michigan and Ohio actually dated back to the Northwest Ordinance, when that ordinance determined that the southern boundary of the soon-to-be state Michigan would be a straight line from the southern end of Lake Michigan to where it intersected Lake Erie. Well, nobody knew for sure where the southern end of Lake Michigan was. And when Ohio became a state, they slipped into their constitution a provision calling for a slightly angled line, their northern boundary, so that it would include the future port of Toledo, which was going to be the northern terminus of a series of canals that Ohio was building. All of its investors were Ohio people, so the governor of Ohio had to protect this investment. So they made sure that their northern boundary included Toledo. After 2 surveys were taken, one by Michigan and one by Ohio, the one by Michigan determined that Toledo was in Michigan, the one by Ohio determined that it was in Ohio, things settled down and Michigan people moved into that strip of contested land, organized it into townships, collected taxes. But then in 1835, things all came to a head when Governor Lucas said, I'm going to protect that land. And Governor Mason said, I'm going to protect that land. And they organized their 2 state, well, the Ohio militia and the territorial militia, and actually got into a shooting war over 470 square miles of basically swamp and farmland that Michigan claimed legally it owned. The war then proceeded in a series of skirmishes throughout 1835. Nobody was killed, so if you're going to have a war, this is the kind of war you want. And it ended up being brokered by Congress in 1836, whereby Congress said that, Michigan, if you give up your claim to the Toledo Strip, as compensation, we will give you the entire western 2/3 of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. That's how Michigan ended up with the Upper Peninsula. And it wasn't until 1837, finally, that Michigan was officially welcomed as a state. When Mason was elected governor, he had already participated in helping to write Michigan's first constitution. That constitution called for a superintendent of public instruction to oversee the schools. This had never been done in any state in the Union up to that time. That constitution called for a prohibition against slavery, which was pretty progressive at that time, considering that the Civil War was still roughly 30 years down the road. Mason was so far ahead of his time, he called for an appropriation to build the Sioux Locks up at Sault Ste. Marie. And for that, he got laughed at by no less a statesman than Henry Clay, the great Henry Clay of Kentucky, who said in effect, well, why don't we just build something on the face of the moon? But all those many years later, when Michigan and Detroit became known as the arsenal of democracy, Michigan had Mason to thank for that vision of building those locks, which could then get those ships bringing all that iron ore in minerals down to the downstate steel mills where they could make the planes and the tanks and everything else to help defeat Germany in World War II. We had Mason to thank for that. Now, the unfortunate thing is his timing, because as soon as Mason became governor, the national financial panic of 1837 hit, and Michigan was one of its chief victims, because Mason had outlined all these expensive plans for development, hoping that he could fund it with good money, but then the banks failed, in part because of President Jackson's policies, in part because of economic conditions at that time. And so Mason was left holding the bag. And he soon developed quite a coherent set of enemies who attacked him for bringing Michigan to the condition that it was. When Mason ran for re-election, he just barely won. And by that time, the Whigs and his opponents were really on his case and accused him of being a demagogue and taking the state and enriching himself at the state's expense. So that, in effect, they ruined Mason in the eyes of Michigan people, who in their short-sightedness forgot all the things that Mason had done prior to then, which was set into place all of our institutions, the educational institutions, get us on the path to statehood, that sort of thing, and they forgot. And so Mason eventually had to leave Michigan in virtual disgrace. Young Mason was elegant. He had bearing, a wonderful Virginia, Kentucky demeanor about him, which at first may have set him off to Michigan frontiersmen as some kind of very lofty individual, but he understood Michigan politics and how it worked, and he became a man of the people. And they loved him so much so that by the time he had died already, at age 31, by the time they brought him back, his body back to Michigan in 1905, enough years had rolled by so that Mason was regarded as a great statesman and a person who had set Michigan off on the right path right from the start.